as all sort of podcast thingies does, and then I'll figure that out. All right. All right. Three, two, one. Welcome to the Time to Grow Up Dad podcast. And today I've got I guess, famous guest in the powerlifting world, so to speak.
I
Uh,
guess.
Mr. Newton Cheng here. Um, Maybe people who actually watch this podcast either on video or listen, people might think that, oh, it's going to be about powerlifting uh, and talk about his insane body to strength ratios. Obviously, Newton also does work for Google. Maybe some people are anticipating some type of big work thing there, but really, Newton was actually very open. And actually, I should have asked this off air. So we're going to dive into a couple of things here today, particularly with a lot of family topics and being a dad and stuff like that. But one of the big things that possibly happened to Newton, and I believe this was in December last year, is that you and your wife found out your daughter had leukemia. Was that in December
Yes. Yeah.
2024?
December 20th, she was diagnosed with leukemia.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously, Newton was very. I was actually very surprised that you didn't say yes, because I think this would be the first time you might be publicly speaking to someone since the incident.
Yes. I've posted on social media
Yeah.
pretty sparingly since the diagnosis. I've slowed down on my posting a lot just as life's gotten really busy and complicated.
Yeah.
But this is the first interview or conversation I've done publicly about this.
Oh wow. Okay, I'll take that as a small ego win.
Congratulations! Yeah, you reached
Yes.
out at the right time. I'm ready.
All right. Yeah. All right. So before we, I guess, do a quick deep dive into all of that, because I have a lot of questions really for me personally, to be honest. Maybe give the listeners or viewers just a little bit of a background of who you are, and if you don't mind disclosing how many kids, and then we can kind of take it from there.
Sure. So I am a husband and father to two daughters. Their ages are almost 3 and 7, and they're actually both adopted. And so there's a whole, as we get into talking about dad dynamics and especially the mental health side of things, that comes with a whole slew of potential mental health complications, and I'm happy to talk about that. Secondly, I am a competitive powerlifter, so I compete primarily in the USAPL. I've also competed in the USPA as well as the IPF, and so currently I'm the M1 national champion in the USAPL, the Open World Champion in the, I guess, IPL, which is the international overarching organization of the USPA, even though I'm pretty sure the USPA owns the IPL.
Pretty sure, yeah. It's convoluted. It's convoluted.
Someone draw the flow chart on that. And then maybe someday I'll go back to the IPF. But currently I'm happy at the USAPL, and I'll be pursuing another Open 56 kilo championship, hopefully in June. And then lastly, the way I describe my career is I'm a leader in the field of health and performance. And there's two big roles in there. I'm director of health and performance at Google, where I oversee a suite of the health and well-being amenities that are there to support the health and well-being of all the amazing employees there. And then the other side of my career, which is beyond Google, is that I am a mental health public speaker and mental health advocate. And so back in 2022, I came public with my own struggles around mental health and burnout. And the reason that I did that was because I work in the field of health and well-being. I already knew all the data of how many people were struggling just like me, both within Google and beyond. But so many of us were hiding it due to stigma. And beyond things like access to care around your mental health, that was one of the things that was impacting people so negatively and continues to. So I decided when I was going to go on mental health leave so that I could be the father and the husband that I wanted and needed to be, I was going to let people know what was going on with me to try to break that stigma. And I wasn't sure if people would care, but since then, I've been invited to speak publicly about that and teach workshops on that for the last 3 years.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's a huge thing, particularly I think for fathers and men. I think I think potentially COVID has really sort of sped up the process. I guess particularly in terms of speaking out a little bit more with mental health stuff, not just within the context of certain clinically diagnosed issues, but also in the context of just general well-being. And I think you made a really great point there, because you have been working in that space for quite a while.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just that someone is sick, then they need to speak out about it. It's like, hey, like someone could feel really bad. Doesn't mean that they have to be diagnosed with something. They should, in any way, shape, or form, get help where and when possible.
Yeah, an analogy. So, as a powerlifter, like, and I assume there are some strength athletes and other athletes in your audience, if
Hopefully.
not 99% of it. The analogy I like to use is, imagine if within your sport you started to get an injury, and you couldn't express that to your fellow athletes or your coach until it was the point of like, oh, this is a full muscle tear, and now I can go get treated for this, and it's clinically diagnosable. That's just stupid. Like,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know how else to put it. That's kind of where our culture around mental health is. Now that we understand we don't need to feel like or go through struggle alone or feel as bad as we often do, like that's kind of what we're doing. We are just driving ourselves into the ground until we need to ask for often clinical level help. Makes no sense.
Yeah, totally. And I think like being, at least for someone in your position, obviously having the platform that you have, being very open about it, hopefully just allows people to get a little bit more, not get a little bit more, allow people to kind of see like, okay, like someone of this caliber is speaking out even before something turns really, really bad. I think that is a very, very good thing you're doing. And I think really what struck me largely was coming back to obviously the diagnoses on the 20th of December. For someone like yourself to go public about it on social media, essentially within like a week, I think. I can't remember exactly when you went public, but I'm pretty confident it's before the new year hits, right? It's something
Yeah.
that probably a lot of people from a mental health standpoint will not really quote unquote pull the trigger because
Mm-hmm.
they can't really find their feet. They can't really figure out like processing the emotions as a parent. Like, oh my God, like, because I believe Kira is the one that was diagnosed with leukemia. Yeah.
Yes.
And she's, I think, 3 years old, right? Like three
She'll be
this year.
3 on March 6th, so less than a month
Oh
away.
wow,
So
that's
she's
cool.
immunocompromised, so we will have a birthday, but it's going to be a little
Yeah, yeah.
smaller. With
Little
it's
smaller.
it's almost like COVID times, like
Yeah, yeah,
except
yeah,
the bubble is just around her.
yeah, 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 for sure. So, like to my point, like you spoke out about it quite quickly, literally like days after you kind of figured that out. How did you and your wife, I guess maybe you personally, because maybe your wife's not here to defend herself, but how did
Hmm.
you deal with the news when it kind of hit? Because usually in my eyes, like when people speak openly about something, they at
Hmm.
least have, or at least they already are at a point where they have processed a lot of things. So for you, it actually, for me, like from my point of view, that was actually quite quick.
It was very quick, and to just now getting into other dad and husband dynamics, I pulled the trigger on that social media post a little too fast and didn't check with my wife.
Ah,
And so that led to, we'll just call it conversation. So actually one area where I try not to speak too openly is my wife is much less public on social media than I am. So I kind of like create a safety bubble around our business there. I am open about like where I stepped on a landmine with her, but I will not go into like the details of those conversations as much.
because
But for me, so when I learned about the news, like I still remember the moment. Um, we had gone into the emergency room because Kira had had persistent swelling around one of her legs for literally weeks. And we'd been taking her to the doctor, getting various tests. They were sending us to other specialists. And in retrospect, what I could see our primary care physician was doing was probably suspecting leukemia, but also trying not to freak out because it wasn't definitive. And you don't want to just tell scared parents, like, well, it could be leukemia. That's not the best idea. So she was trying to guide us, take our time, and then eventually one morning I get Kira out of her bed and I'm changing her and I see the swelling in her leg. It's increased dramatically. Like one of her legs is clearly, 20% bigger now in volume than the other one. So I call my wife in and say and show it to her, and we decide, okay, let's take her. Let's call our doctor. She says, go to this emergency room where they have this specialist on call. We go to the emergency room. It's pretty backed up, so it was a pretty long wait, like 7 hours. But she's in a good mood. I brought lots of snacks, games, so we had 7 hours of playtime in the emergency room. Not ideal, but that's life. And then we get to the doctor, and he says, "Oh, so we're just going to admit you because we need to run a series of tests, and it's easier to just have you here. We can run the tests, we can get the results back faster." And so I say, okay. So we go up to their pediatrics ward. We are in a hospital room. She, all the nurses are falling in love with her. She's has a bubbly personality. We finally get her down for bed. I'm sleeping on a pull-out couch, and then I wake up. It's probably about 5 in the morning, and it's all dark. The only light in the room is the monitors that are tracking her vitals. And I see our doctor, and she's hovering over me, and she says, "Good morning. So I want you to know that it looks like Kira may have leukemia." And my first response was, "Okay, may, like, is there play in the system in that statement?" Like, and so I say, "Well, how will we know? Like, what's the possibility it's something else?" And she just cut it off there and she said, "It's leukemia." And so it's interesting. In that moment, I went very numb. Like, I think that it's too big a thing to process. So I just kind of breathed and I'm like, okay. Now, I think what the doctor did, which for the way that I cope, was very helpful. She warned me. She's like, okay, a lot of things are going to have to happen really fast. And I just want you to know that. And so immediately she steps outside. The nurses are all lined up. A group of nurses walk in. They start strapping her up, doing blood draws, administering medicine right away. We start scheduling like procedures. Like all these things have to happen really quickly. And I do have a part in some of this. I need to be informed. I need to also care for her in between these procedures. So it's like action, 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 action. For me, that's an excellent way to cope. Like give me something to do. Like
Yes,
let me
yes.
participate. So if they had, just had me sit, or if there was like just a quiet period and I had to just sit with that, I would have gone insane. I would have lost it. But luckily there was, not luckily, but just as it happens, that's the way the process goes. And so for the next day, it was logistics of the procedures, paperwork, figuring out like, oh, I didn't pack for this. Like, okay, am I going to coordinate with my wife? And I got another kid out there. How are we going to coordinate on childcare? Um, where do I get food? All these really basic things. Like one of the things that came up was I suddenly realized like, oh, I am going to be here a while. And so I asked the doctor, how long am I going to be here? Like a day? And the doctor's like, well, she's going to probably have to be here 2 to 4 weeks. And I'm like, oh, well, I came with my work backpack. So do you have deodorant?
Yeah, yeah.
And they, strangely, what they do have is they have toothbrushes, they have shampoo. They do not have deodorant. So they said, but we have disinfecting wipes because we have to keep this place really clean. So they gave me a pack of disinfecting wipes. And
Close
so,
enough.
yeah. So I'm wearing the same clothes for a few days. I'm using my disinfecting wipes in place of deodorant. I'm, brushing my teeth with their hotel style toothbrush. And then eventually I get a moment to breathe. Like when my wife shows up, we do the handoff and I go home. And that's when I could start processing a little bit. So that was probably a full 2 days.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds yeah, even just sort of obviously listening on the receiving end,
Mm-hmm.
like people always kind of use the analogy of I'm going to try to put myself in your shoes, like people always say like I'm going to try to put myself in your position and see how I play the scenario out in my head. But I think like, I think as parents, like something like that is not something that tends to happen like quite quickly. Like I think it's
Mm-hmm.
one of those things where see my little
Yeah,
boy
I
there.
just saw your little one back there.
Yeah,
Speaking
yeah,
of
she's really
parenting.
great. Yeah, speaking of parenting, hey, that's the podcast. I guess that's how it rolls.
Yes.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, it's one of those things. Like, it's hard to put myself in anyone's shoes and your shoes, particularly in this situation, because I can say, oh, I would have done this in retrospect. Oh, yeah, I would have think of it this way in retrospect. You can't. I don't think it's something that people can kind of, for dear listener or viewer listening to this, I don't think you can necessarily say, oh yeah, unless if you have a very similar experience, I don't think it's something you can relate. So thanks a lot for sharing, and I think like it's just important, for listeners, like if you guys are listening to this, like yeah, just understand like it's a very tricky situation.
Yeah. I think there's, one of the things that it was almost like, the I listened to this podcast called The Art of Accomplishment, and it's the host. He coaches a lot. He's a former venture capitalist, a successful business person, coaches a lot of very high performing executives. And he really, one of the things he teaches them about is gratitude. And he's saying, in order to cultivate gratitude, you can't just practice when the good things are happening. Like you have to find a way to be grateful for all of it, like
Yeah,
all of it,
yeah.
like leukemia. And I had been listening to that, and I had actually just commented on one of the reactive training systems coaches. So I work with a powerlifting coaching team called Reactive Training Systems, and he had uh, posted a story about acceptance and how are you guys at accepting things. And I replied and was, giving my own stance on acceptance. That was literally one day before a leukemia diagnosis. And then, suddenly I'm like, oh, okay, like all great when you say that, when life is good. Like,
It's one of those
yeah,
things, right? Like
yeah, it's
people
like,
can say all they want, but when
how are you
shit
going to
goes
accept
down,
this? Yes. How are
yeah,
you going
yeah,
to
yeah.
accept this? How are you going to find gratitude for it? And it was almost like a test from the universe of
Mm,
like, are you really putting in the work? Like, are you really cultivating that way of being? And I think I had to spend. So the first thing that I did when I got home, or one of the first things I did was, my other daughter was at school. I went in the garage and started doing my squats because it's what I knew. It anchored me.
yeah,
And in between sets, I started thinking about how did I feel about this? And have you ever heard seen the hashtag fuck cancer?
yeah,
Yeah. And that it's got a pretty good brand, so that came to mind, but I'm like, that's not what I'm feeling. Like I think
yeah,
that felt like the easy guy response, but I don't think that's what actually. I think I'm past that, converting everything to anger. I'm like, what's actually in there? It was a lot of fear, because we still didn't know how the treatment was going to go, but it was also a lot of grief because what I had seen was I had this expectation of what Kira's childhood would look like, at least for the next few years. This meant like, nope, we're going to pull her out of the daycare she loves. She can't go do all those activities that we had planned. We're not going to have the family summer vacation we wanted. Um, she's not going to be able to play with her sister, at least for the next few weeks, the way that she always has. And it was, you kind of see your vision for a happy life was just all an illusion. Um, so it was a lot of sadness and grief. And that's more what I had to process. Now, on acceptance, what I realized was at some point, this odd thought came to me where it's like, okay, if this is acceptance and the reason you're grieving is because the life you expected to have turned out to be an illusion. Now, cancer is unlikely statistically, but it's non-zero. So another expectation, why did you expect that your children would grow up cancer free? Like,
Hmm.
it was just not on my radar, but I'm like, yeah, I did have that expectation
Yeah.
for, no particular reason. It was more like a hope. And so the way that I got to acceptance was to say, okay, the universe dealt you a card. Like they dealt you the cancer card for your daughter. What happened afterward? Like all bets are off. There was nothing to say you wouldn't draw that card. What happened afterward was I could see we had access to excellent care. We had the means and the flexibility in our jobs to help my daughter navigate that care. All the people who, in midlife, you start to lose contact with lots of people. They all came out of the woodwork offering love and support. Even if, like, many of them, they can't do anything, they could send a meal, or they can even just send kind words. And when you see all that in aggregate, it gives you faith that if you've tried to be a good person and sow positive seeds, you see all those flowers bloom right at once. And so even in like a dark grieving moment, like, there was so much brightness in that. But it was hard to find. If I had just gone straight to anger and treated this like a lot of people I've talked to who are on this journey, they take this stance of we're
Why
preparing for
me?
war. Yeah,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
there's why me, and then we're preparing for war to fight this. And I'm like, there's nothing to fight. Like, I'm sorry, this is part of your human experience. Like, what are you fighting? I don't quite understand that mentality. It's like you just dealt this card, embrace it, and see what the universe brings you next. And that's instead what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I think a really good phrase, I think like a Latin Stoic phrase would be amor fati, lover of fate. And I
Mm,
think like what you're kind of doing there is pretty much sort of synonymous in that sense. I think a lot of people, um, and maybe another concept, if you will, is sort of leading very much into the uncomfortableness of the situation or the cards they've been dealt, rather than viewing it as like that was a bad hand. It's like, you've been dealt the hand, you kind of just have to play it out and see what happens, right? Like there's
yeah.
two that, like, yeah, and maybe obviously, Newton's obviously sharing some vulnerable stuff here. I'll share one, right? Like, back when I was probably like 16, when I was in my young age, one of the big things I struggled a lot with when mental health was like having to kind of obviously decide whether to take my own life or not,
Mm,
right? It's one of those
yeah.
big things, like, people talk about it, but you go through all that stuff. And I think one of the big things there, it's like exactly to Newton's point, to a degree, it's like in the end of the day, like you are dealt with a set of cards. There's only two ways you can kind of really play this game out, so to speak. One, you fold, and back in my case, I guess back then, that folding would literally mean trying to end my life. Or you can just try
Hmm.
to play it out, or just play it out, just play it out, right? You don't know what will
Yeah.
happen, just play it out, just keep playing, just stay in the game, just keep playing with what you've dealt. And as corny as it sounds, life finds a way.
It definitely does. Well, one, I'm glad you decided to play it out, and here
Yeah.
we are today. And
Yeah, no,
you
it's
know,
it's wild. It's wild, and I say that to everyone. It's like,
yeah.
yes. let it play it out, man. Like, just see what happens.
One thing I discovered as before leukemia, I was already posting pretty openly about my mental health and struggles from my past on social media. A young Asian man reached out to me via DMs, and he said something to the effect of like, "I really appreciate your openness and vulnerability. I didn't know we could do that."
Yeah,
And I responded, I'm like, "What do you mean?" And it was he was like, "Well, I didn't know I could say those things, or it was okay to feel those things." And if I think about 16-year-old you, I wonder,
yeah,
for the hand you were dealt, did you feel like uniquely like, I must be the only one with this hand who's fucking it up in this way, and
yeah,
therefore maybe I should just fold?
yeah.
And
Yeah, I
so,
mean, yeah,
yeah.
for sure. Like for me, it was like that decision, right? Like I think like I do post about it quite openly as well. I do talk a little bit about it. Obviously, not to the extent that you do, but it's kind of one of those things. I always kind of paint that picture of like you're still in the game, right? Like at the end of the day, like I think
Hmm.
back then, my decision was very much, like very clear picture in my head still up till this point. Like I was living in Malaysia. And in Malaysia, we've got condos, so less of a 2, 3 story house, more so big, complex apartments. I remember very much like overlooking the 13th floor, which is obviously where we lived, and I was like contemplating, and I was kind of thinking to myself, like, like what's the deal here, right? Like, I don't really see an out. Like you ever play a
Hmm.
game, any type of game, you don't see an out. You don't see an out. You don't see an out. You literally can't. But I kind of had like a moment, and I think very much to something uh, in that runs parallels with how you kind of view it. It's like, I've been dealt the hand. Like, I can't really see what happens. In your case, you've obviously visualized a perfect life for Kira, and obviously that kind of went to the wayside. Very much similar to me. I was kind of like, well, that didn't go according to plan, but let's just play it out. Let's just play it out and see what happens. And I think, like, yeah, to your point, I think particularly, I think in an Asian, growing up in Asia, like definitely back then, the stigma was very much like um, how you received their DM. It's like I didn't know I could be so vulnerable, and I think over time that obviously grew. I think
Mm.
people are speaking a little bit more openly about it, and it's good to see. And yeah, I like your take on something actually. Speaking about vulnerability, is you mentioned you went back home. Your eldest was still in school. You went to do some squats. You were trying to process everything. Um, how do you, as a father and a husband, how do you show your vulnerability to your family? Like, how do you go about that?
Mm.
Because you speak about it
Yeah.
very like, publicly, and we sort of talked about this. I can't remember on air or off air about there's obviously certain things where we will not talk about, but to a degree, like speaking about something publicly isn't always the same about speaking wholeheartedly on what you tell your family, because some things will be taken the wrong way, and you don't want it to obviously go that way, right? Especially with kids. We sort
Yeah. So actually, I'll tell you where I'm at now, and then I'll tell you about the process of like, okay, how did you? It's been a process to, I'll call it a skill almost. Vulnerability, I truly believe, is a skill, and in the workshops that I do around mental health, they're actually skill building workshops around helping people be vulnerable, oftentimes in front of professional colleagues. But I've done this now enough where I'm like, it's actually way easier to get people to open up than they think if I just set up like the right moves. It's like just do steps A, B, C, D, and then there's a bunch of human dynamics that'll get you all to reciprocate with each other and then progressively disclose more. It takes care of itself as long as I
awesome.
facilitate the group correctly. Now, for me, so I'll give an example of how I talk about it with my older daughter who's 7. So she really likes me to tell her stories from my past. And I remember when she first started asking for that, I started thinking like, oh, I got to think of stories that are like funny and interesting, or ones where I'm like, there's a lesson to take away. And like, I faced this challenge and it, it was daunting, but I overcame. And someday you can be like daddy.
It's a classic
Yeah.
Disney story arc.
Yeah. And then I was thinking about that and I'm like, what is that bullshit? And like, no, that's not what it's going to feel like to her. Like, I don't
Yeah.
want her to take away the lesson of you're not validated till you've overcome. And that might occur sometime, like years, decades later, once you look
Yeah,
back
yeah,
as an
yeah.
adult. So instead, what I started doing was I say, okay, I'm 46 years old. So I might tell her, pick a number between 5 and 45. And she'll pick a number like 29. I think back to a story from when I was 29 about a difficult situation I faced or an odd situation. I tell her about the ways in which I showed up in that situation that I'm not super proud of and how I'm trying to be different now. So
Ooh,
like
I like that.
last night I was if my friend Rob is listening to this, I explained how he's one of my closest friends now. Back when I met him when I think the number was 20. So I met him when I was 20. I was a judgmental asshole towards him. And he was an awkward dude who was 20 and he was just trying to strike up conversation and did a really bad job of it. And we look back and on that conversation, we both remember we're like, yeah, that was awkward. That was super weird, Rob. And I was really judgy towards you. Sorry. And so he started the conversation with like he didn't know what to say, but he really liked volleyball, and we had never met, and so he kicked off with, "Do you like volleyball?" And I'm just like, "Who who are you, and why are you asking me about volleyball, you weirdo?" And so I explained this to my daughter because it starts off like a little weird and comedically, but then I can explain to her like, you know, Uncle Rob back then, he was just trying to make friends and he didn't know how to do it. Like I was being kind of mean by not really just, um, thinking about, well, okay, that was weird, but this guy's just trying to connect with me. Like, what's he trying to do here, and how can I meet him for where he's at? Because I want to make friends too. And so I told her that story instead of I could tell her stories about like, let me tell you about how hard daddy works so he wins powerlifting competitions. Like we can do like 1 out of 10. I will do those, but the rest of them, I do these stories about like, yeah, here's how daddy didn't know what the hell he was doing. And he tried to hide it so he'd look cool. And that didn't go well. And I'm still a work in progress, even though I try to pretend like I have it all together.
Mm, yeah, I like that. I'm actually gonna steal that. Like there's obviously
I think
one thing my wife.
everyone should. Yeah,
Everyone
let's
should. Everyone
yes,
should. I think like
pass.
that's a very good strategy because like my wife and I were having a conversation the other day about like, all right, like at some point, like they're gonna want like bedtime stories or they want to read stories, and I think like that is such a good strategy because you can like it also forces you to reflect back on your life, which retrospective reflections generally will help most people set things into perspective to allow you to kind of go, actually life ain't that bad right now, kind of thing, right? Most of the time, I'd say most of the time. I think like that's such a good strategy because like one, you're able to kind of give your kids a bedtime story, which is real essentially, but two, it also kind of allows you as the parent to really reflect on that. So that's definitely something I will steal for sure.
Yes.
Everyone should. Everyone should. That's a really good one. That's a goodie.
Now I'll say in building up to doing that better and better, one of the things I've had to do, and some of this comes from my wife in terms of awareness of her emotions. She's more advanced than me. She's been on this journey longer, and so she's kind of she's influenced me a lot in a positive way there. She complains that I never like give her credit during podcasts, and I'm like, did you listen to it? Like I do that over and over. I don't sound that aggressive when I respond, but seriously, like she's
Yeah.
great. She's the better human being than me. honey, if you're listening, like, for the record, I said it again. Anyway, now, um, I had to do a lot of work to actually, before I get into that, the way one of my friends puts it is that guys are only allowed to feel two things: angry or awesome. And I kind of agree with that. And so I had to spend a lot of time to say, like, okay, there's a lot of different feelings. Like,
Mm.
can I even name different feelings? And then in a moment where I am feeling strong emotions, can I say something other than pissed off? Or can I say, like, oh yeah, that's effing awesome. Like, like,
Yeah.
just extreme happiness or extreme aggressive,
Yeah.
um, feelings. So things like being able to say, I feel sad, I think I'm grieving, I'm worried, I'm scared. Like, it took a while for me to, like, anytime I get angry, to just sit with it for a while and be like, well, what's under the anger? Sometimes it's just
Mm.
straight in, something is unjust and I'm angry. But most of the time, it's actually one of those feelings that makes me feel weak. And now I'm lashing out by turning into anger. So step one is, like, pierce into that, get good at seeing what's underneath that, name it, ask yourself then, well, why do I think I feel that way? Or why might I feel that way? And if I do that over and over and over, so I've developed the internal awareness, the second one step is, can you tell someone? So now, like, you need to find, like, those safe relationships where you can have those conversations, maybe with your spouse, maybe with some key friends. So I actually have a small group of other Asian, um, male friends who are all barbell athletes, and we call ourselves IBS, and that stands for in between sets. Because
Nice.
we think of,
Nice.
like, you have real talk when you're sitting in
Yes,
between
yes, yes. In
sets,
between sets. Yes,
and
yes.
then of course IBS. It's just funny and
It's a
immature.
play. It's a play on. I don't
And
know. I
so,
think
yeah,
I like it. I like it.
yeah, so we
Yeah,
get to, like, kind of practice that with one another and, like, coach each other through
for
what's
sure.
going on. And that's been, like, such a huge addition to my life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think like one thing I sort of took away there as well, and this is I listen to a lot of podcasts, read books and stuff, and I think one of the big things is I used to, and I'm trying not to, but like it's one of those things where you are consistently working on. It's like to your point, like you have to establish what you're feeling and then go underneath. My current favorite way of doing that would be journaling. Like I'm just a big
Hmm.
proponent of it. I try to journal as much as I can because like it kind of helps you process the emotions a little bit more. But then one of the bigger things is like community.
Yeah.
I think like it doesn't have to be a grandiose 100 people fucking Tony Robbins community. It could just be between 5 or 3 even. And even if
I
you
think
kind of
that's
think
actually
about it,
better.
yeah, and even in a
Yeah.
very granular sense, like even yourself, even within the context of a family,
Hmm.
that technically does play into the community too. Having that and having something external, having different communities to allow you to potentially access different opinions. I think that's
Hmm.
something that I sort of picked up there because obviously yourself and your wife, obviously you guys are super amazing, gel together very well. But you also mentioned you've got the whole IBS situation, group, not condition, and that can potentially give you like a very different perspective as well. So I think like not just having a community, but having a couple of communities or
Hmm.
pockets that can give you different perspectives to allow you to not really solve the situation, but it's just giving yourself a little bit more openness and awareness on, okay, like maybe I want to take it this way, maybe I want to take it that way in the end of the day, right? Because your thoughts are your thoughts.
Yeah.
But if you've
So
got some people who are close, then
something wise that you figured out intuitively there. I heard a stat that, um, looking at the outcomes for ways to improve your mental health, um, cognitive behavioral therapy showed outcomes about equal to, or maybe not even as good as, talking about your problems to friends.
Yeah,
So what you are doing and what you're setting up for yourself is like, you know, better than potentially very expensive therapy, and like just this amazing source of resilience for yourself ongoing.
yeah,
So good for you.
yeah, yeah, 100%. Yeah, and I think like obviously Newton, you're a big proponent of mental health. Well, one thing I did want to quickly pick your brain on here, because I know I don't want to take too much of your time. I know we're always time. I think time is the most valuable asset in life. But one thing I want to pick your brain here, and I think this is something that fathers tend to struggle a lot. Um, how does what would your advice be, or what would your train of thought be as a father to have this idea or this concept, which is, in my opinion, I don't think it's true. Some might beg to differ, but this idea of needing to keep food on the table, right? Because we always hear, mums give birth, sweet, mom's going to nurse the baby. Obviously, in your case, adopt it. Doesn't really matter too much. There's still going to be a motherly love connotation around the mum being kind of almost a primary care person in a standard family. Obviously, if you're a single parent, that would be a very different dynamic. But for dads, we, at least the way I hear about it, is dads need to go out, hustle, work, put food on the table, spend time with kids, of course. But your primary goal here is to make sure that we keep a roof above everyone's heads, right? And I think as dads, like one of the big things I'm struggling with, and I want to get your thoughts on this, and I hear this a lot. It's like, I want to spend more time with the family. Fuck, I want to. I really want to. But I understand the responsibilities of a mother is that, literally biologically, at least in the, male female situation, they can breastfeed, they can care for the baby. And so it makes logical sense for the father to go out, hunter gatherer style, whatever you want to call it, work, put food. How do you, what your kind of thought process or advice there be? Because for me, like, I want to spend time with my family. But I also
Yeah.
understand, like, my wife is expecting a second baby, ironically, anytime. That's why she's
Mm-hmm.
walking in and out. How do you go about that? Like, what would your thought or your advice be?
Yeah, I think I can think of it in two ways. One, or a few different ways. One is like just the math of the situation. If you got to go work and make money so that the family has food on the table, regardless of who does it, someone better go do it. Quite important. So
Yes.
let's hit that. Get out of the just barely surviving tier to where you guys have the possibility of thriving, and it's up to your spouse and you to figure out like how you want to bring that together. Now, in terms of societal roles, like if I look at it via that lens, I think I've seen actually good arguments on from a variety of perspectives of like it should be fluid between men and women. And then I've seen other people saying like, well, no, I actually feel like for various reasons that there are traditional roles and traditions is important. Um, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I don't think I'm smart enough to also counter all the arguments I've heard. Where I've seen some where I'm like, okay, I'll ponder that. Now, what I would say for each individual is, um, to be frank, fuck that shit. Like, what do you want out of your life? What do you and your wife want to build in terms of the ecosystem around you? And if yes, you can adopt those roles dictated by society, but what possibilities do you wipe off the table because you did that? And are you okay with that? Like, if you just say, fuck society and your expectations, like, I'm here to build the life I want, what becomes possible that you couldn't consider before you got rid of those expectations? And so I would say for me, if you said, do you want to adhere to expectations or do you want more possibilities? I'd be like, more possibilities. Like, I don't know why
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
I whose expectations I'm meeting. Like, yeah, fine, I'll disappoint some people. I don't care.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny you say that, because it almost kind of ties back to, I guess, we're just about like 40 minutes, and like kind of what we started this conversation about, right? With like, you dealt with the cards at hand, like, like you want the possibilities to happen. And I think like that's something I'm kind of coming to terms as well, it kind of in my own personal life. making some very radical career choices in order to help ultimately build this vision to allow me to be that father figure that I want, rather than having to be pressured into a more societal concept of like go to work. You have to make family thrive. It's like, yeah, I get it. Like, we all get it. Like, money is important, right? Let's not beat around the bush. A house, food, necessities, basics, all those stuff. But then I think outside of that, it's like, the way that I'm looking at it right now. Obviously, our situations are quite different. It's like I've only got this much time to spend with my kids until they get to a point where they start to develop their own relationships outside of a family setting. And then what? Like, the possibilities are endless, to obviously, to your point. But then it's also like, well, if you don't take that opportunity now, you literally have no options or possibilities down the track to have varying branches of possible relationships you can develop with your kids. Whereas if you sacrifice everything now and say, okay, like, let's just focus on that. And again, like, every parent is different. Your philosophies will be different, dear listener. But it's like, what do you value, right? Like, if you value truly, truly to be that parent and be there for your kids and stuff like that, I think like having that openness to say, okay, like, let's just pull back a little bit, which allows a lot more possibilities on one end. There's always a cost for everything, but as long as you get
Yeah.
copied at the chin a little bit, you copy the chin a little bit, it's like,
Hmm.
all right, like, let's just, in the long run, this will pay out. It's kind of like, you dealt with the cards. In the long run, it'll pay out. You just got to stick with it a little bit. I think it's a better way to think of it.
Yeah. I in that social media post I made about my daughter having leukemia, I was feeling pretty raw and a little poetic. And I think I said something to the effect of, hug your loved ones and treat each of those hugs as infinitely valuable because you
Mm.
only get so many more of them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so if I think about that, like, I was carrying my daughter around this morning, like trying to saute chicken breasts because I'm cutting.
Yeah.
and and
Damn
my
it,
only
Kendrick.
thought yes. And so my only thought was like, oh man, my arm is burning right now. Like, do I have to carry this kid around? But then I also think in a few years, like, you'll never do this again.
Because they don't
You'll
want to.
never.
It's not
Yeah.
even a case of whether you can. It's they just don't want to.
Yes. Yeah. Like, even if I go up a few weight classes so I can continue to carry her, like,
Yeah, like
yeah,
she might just say, "No, I'm done."
yeah. And if I lost those opportunities because I don't value them, or I decided, you know what, I can't pick you up. I got to answer these emails. Sometimes I got to answer those emails, but a lot of the time I don't.
Yeah,
And I'm not going
that's the
to
thing.
miss the emails.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, man. I think, yeah, very much in complete agreement with you there, man. So to maybe wrap this all up, you um, what's your biggest lesson as a parent and a father so far?
I think I'll try to pander to your audience a little bit and take this back to powerlifting. and
Yes,
and so
it can be taken any way. To be fair, any way you want to take it, man. Any way you want
maybe
to
I'm
take it,
just pandering to myself because I love powerlifting.
possibly.
Uh, as I've stayed on my training, like, I have not missed a training day despite the leukemia diagnosis. And the feedback I always get is like, "Oh, you're so disciplined. You're so disciplined." What I have realized is, like, it doesn't feel like discipline to me. What it feels like is, I'm not 26, I'm 46. So I've been doing this for a while. I'm pretty um I still have a long ways to go in terms of understanding myself anywhere close to fully. Like, I think that's an infinite
Hmm.
journey. But I do understand myself way better than when I was 26. And so me getting up at, 4:30 a.m. to go in the garage and squat in the cold, you could call that discipline. That's me just trying to be more myself. Like, I do it
Mm.
because doing something hard that makes me feel like I'm growing and that I enjoy, Like that's me just expressing myself. And the rubber really hit the road with the leukemia diagnosis. You get a really real test of like, okay, when I really turn up the heat in your life, what falls away and what does not. And
Mm.
so first day I got back from the hospital, I didn't, and I'd been wiping myself down with disinfecting wipes for 2 days. This is gross. I didn't go straight to the shower. I went straight to the garage and started squatting because I needed to be me.
It's so funny you say that. I mean, it's actually just funny you say that because I was making a video yesterday and obviously posting on social media. It's the whole idea of like weekend warriors and stuff like that. There's obviously stuff that we want to do, right? Like powerlifting, whatever, like inset activity. It doesn't even have to be lifting, just inset activity. And then kids come.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have that choice on like, do you like, you clearly still have passion for this said hobby activity, but you also don't want to get it to a point where it almost feels like you have to give that up. And so something that you said there with the whole 4:30 thing, and like I know some people love Jocko and some people love it, and they go, obviously his version of this is like you get up, it's discipline and stuff like that. The way I view it is actually very much it's synonymous to the way you view it, and I pretty much get up at 4 quarter past 4 as well, which is like there's only that much time in the day. If you want to like do something for yourself and just feel like you have two options, right? You either like give that up because you've got kids, or you try to just find a way to get that done, even if it means sacrificing a little bit of sleep. Like it just allows you to be you, and I think like if you're you more, you can show up a lot better. Whereas
Yes.
if you're not you, some people argue, oh, but what about sleep? It's like, oh, fuck that. Like, like I can cop 2 hours of sleep deprivation with some coffee, man. Like I'm good. Like, we're fine with that. Like blah, blah, blah health, blah, 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 blah. But at the end of the day, like if you're you, you can show up so much better. Like, and that's just my thing. And I'm
Yes.
sure you feel that. I'm sure you feel that too.
Yes, I mean there's versions of me throughout the multiverse. There's one where I'm in the garage at 4 a.m. singing. There's one where I'm dancing. There's one where I'm sculpting. It just so happens the one I do is like I move around big weights and people think
Yeah,
that looks
exactly.
badass. So they're like, "That's disciplined and so awesome."
It's
I'm
like,
like,
not
"Yeah, well,
really.
I'm glad you feel that way, but this is just me being me."
Yeah, exactly, man. Makes just me and me. That's cool, man. I like it. I like it. So, where can people find you? Where can people get help? Because I know you do some public speaking gigs as well. Like throw up some social media stuff. I'll put it in the show notes and whatnot.
Yeah, I'll say the best ways to find me are my email is newtoncheng at gmail.com.
Mm-hmm.
Newtoncheng.com is my poorly maintained website. So I will improve that someday. And if you submit something via the form, I might get to it. But more reliable would be the email as well as my Instagram. I'm just at Newton Cheng. And then LinkedIn, I'm under my name, Newton Cheng, of course, there too. Now, for public speaking and workshops, my availability is really, really cramped right now, especially with the leukemia treatments. Um, but reach out. I'll do my best, and or we'll figure out something someday down the road when we're through this. Thanks for having me. Super fun.